The air conditioning at the engagement banquet was set painfully low, as if deliberately trying to suppress the restless heat simmering in everyone's hearts during this lavish evening. The cold air crept through the gaps between my shoulders and neck left bare by my gown, burrowing into my bones and sending a fine, quivering chill across my skin. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing down at the city bathed in neon lights. The brilliant glow of the lamps cast a dazzling shine, yet beneath each light, a brewing conspiracy might be hiding. The icy metal of the cup pressed against my warm palm, the red wine refracting a dull luster under the warm yellow shadows, like aged bloodstains. I took a sip, and bitterness spread across my tongue. This taste was all too familiar. I didn't need to turn around to sense the rotting stench of betrayal behind me. It mixed into the expensive perfume, nauseatingly foul. "Miss Zoe, I'm going to compete with you fairly for Mr. Jason." The moment that name exploded in the center of the banquet hall, my fingers gripping the cup paused slightly. Yvette, her voice, youthful yet deliberately raised, stood out sharply amidst the elegance and glamour. She wore a pure white spaghetti-strap dress, layers of sheer fabric cascading, like a wild lily forcing its way into a crack of steel and concrete. She stood in the middle of the hall, her gaze stubbornly fixed on me, a hint of almost pathological excitement flickering in her eyes. She was waiting for me to fight back hysterically, or to break down crying like a child whose toy had been snatched away. That way, this engagement banquet could turn into a farce full of human conflict, entertainment for the onlookers. Deathly silence fell around us. All the clinking of glasses froze at that moment, the air thick with a stifling blend of champagne and hypocrisy. The guests' gazes swept back and forth between Yvette and me like searchlights, some held a contemptuous air of watching a show, others betrayed undisguised curiosity. I slowly turned around. The silk gown rustled softly against my ankles, the sound crisp in the vast, empty hall. I didn't show the shock, embarrassment, or anger she had anticipated. My breathing was steady, my heartbeat perfectly calm. I merely gave her a faint, indifferent glance, my gaze as cold as if I were looking at a decaying ornament. Then, stepping past her, I stopped precisely in front of a man nearby who stood with a wine glass in hand, watching coldly. Jason. When he saw me looking, that face hidden behind the perfect mask gave a nearly imperceptible frown. He set down his glass with elegant composure and strode over with long, measured steps. Each step carried the unique arrogance of someone in power. Then he reached out and wrapped his arm around Yvette's shoulder, a motion so fluid and natural, as if it had been rehearsed 1,000 times. "Zoe, Yvette is pregnant," Jason said, his tone as cold as if he were discarding a defective part. "This mess is getting ugly, and it's not good for the stock prices of both the Zhong and Shen families. You're a smart person. You should know what to do." He paused, the greed in his eyes flickering like wildfire. "Hand over the seal of the core project's lead, and call off the engagement. Don't make this awkward for everyone." His fingertips trembled slightly with excitement as he pointed at me. I traced the rim of my glass, my gaze shifting from his face to the faint trembling of Yvette's fingertips. "So that was it. So this is the grand scheme you've been orchestrating for the past 3 months?" I gently swirled the wine in my glass. The red liquid clung to the sides before slowly trickling down, the clink of the glass jarringly loud in the silent hall. I walked toward the main control panel. Jason, assuming I was heading for the seal, relaxed his tense expression slightly, replacing it with a smug, condescending look of assured victory. He knew the past life version of me all too well, the woman who, when faced with betrayal in love, would always cave out of heartbreak. But he had no idea that the woman standing before him now was no longer that person. "Jason, do you want control of this project?" I lit up the tablet in my hand, my fingers dancing like butterflies as I instantly connected to the main screen projection system in the venue. "Then do you know what the real technical logic behind this project is?" On the large screen, a dense catalog of code libraries began to scroll. Jason's gaze shifted slightly, those were indeed the core source codes of the project he had long coveted. "My technical team at the Shin Corporation created that, and I have the authority to decide the person in charge." His tone remained steady, but his eyes were already glued to the screen. Excellent. I curled the corner of my mouth. Then let all the guests present, as well as the tens of thousands of shareholders currently watching the live stream, bear witness together to this Project Core Asset Transfer Authorization document. A contract popped up on the big screen. The terms were clear and concise, and beneath them was a striking annotation: upon the effective date of this authorization letter, Party B, Jason, confirms full responsibility for the integrity and security of the project's code repository. Jason stared at that line, his brow furrowing slightly. He didn't understand why I was shifting the responsibility for the code repository's integrity onto him. It was clearly giving him the legal basis to take full control of the project. Zoe, what do you mean by this? There was a hint of wariness in his tone. I pushed the tablet toward him, tapping lightly on the screen twice. The content on the big screen abruptly shifted. Beneath the code repository, another set of data emerged. Dense financial records, every inflow and outflow accounted for down to the cent, the corresponding shell company codes, bank account numbers, and transaction times, all laid out in clear detail. Jason's face changed. This? He stared at the screen, his pupils contracting sharply. All your records of unauthorized financing violations inside the Jeune Corporation, I said softly, as if discussing the weather, have been hidden deep within the codebase of this project. You thought you deleted them, but I kept backups. And now, by signing this handover authorization, you are officially accepting and confirming the connection between this data and the project. I paused, watching the cold sweat forming on his forehead. Mr. Jason, can you afford to sign this betrothal gift? The air in the hall turned to ice. Yvette seemed to sense something was wrong and tugged at Jason's sleeve, but he roughly shook her hand off. The movement was harsh and hasty, causing her to stagger half a step, the color draining from her face. Jason's pupils were locked onto the large screen. At the very end of those financial records, there was a striking red box marked, "This document will be automatically triggered upon the completion of Party B's electronic signature to Jeune Group Audit Department, CSRC Public Whistleblowing Email." His Adam's apple rolled violently. You. His voice turned hoarse. You've been 3 months. I looked at him calmly. From the very first time you contacted Yvette, I was already preparing this gift. Jason felt as if a fist had struck him square in the chest. He instinctively stepped back half a pace, beads of sweat slid down his forehead, gleaming with a pathetic sheen under the warm yellow light. His fingertips hovered over the tablet screen, yet he couldn't bring himself to press down. By now, that agreement in his eyes was no longer a crown of power, but a guillotine. Just then, the doors to the banquet hall were pushed open once more. It wasn't the ordinary sound of a door being opened, but carried an unyielding, murderous aura. In that instant, the air seemed to be sucked dry from the room. Lucas. He stood behind the heavy double doors, his figure framed by the doorway like a stark, cold painting. The shoulder lines of his dark gray custom suit were as sharp as a blade, slicing through the frivolous air of the hall. He brought no attendants, came alone, yet he exuded the intimidating presence of an entire army. Everyone's gaze was drawn to him, including Jason's. Since this is an engagement banquet, why not include me? Lucas's voice was deep, carrying an innate magnetism, yet beneath that piercing coldness, there was an undeniable sense of control. He strode through the crowd, his gaze burning as it landed on me. In that instant, I caught a rare flicker in his eyes, something akin to a hunter's appreciation upon encountering a prey just as formidable. Then, in the next second, he turned to Jason, his tone dropping sharply. Jason, 3 years ago, when you were after that piece of land south of the city, do you remember what you did to my Lu Corporation? The pen in Jason's hand froze abruptly before it could touch the screen. Lucas, President Lucas? His voice trembled noticeably for the first time. He tried to maintain a shred of dignity, but the cold sweat beading on his forehead had already betrayed him completely. What, forgotten? Lucas approached, his steps unhurried. With each step he took, the crowd instinctively fell back. The head of Loose Capital, which Shin Group had always tried to avoid confronting, now stood right before him. That short-selling stunt cost me over 80 million. Today, I hear your financial chain has hit a snag. Lucas casually took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter but didn't drink. He tilted the glass, letting the amber liquid slide down the rim and drip onto the red carpet, like blood seeping into the fabric. Jason, if you sign this agreement, the Securities Regulatory Commission will be waiting for you. And before that, he pulled a neatly folded document from his coat and flicked it open in front of Jason. This is Loose Capital's comprehensive audit intention letter for the Shin Group's financial chain. 3-year-old accounts, combined with today's fraud, are enough to turn your empire into ruins within 3 months. Jason's face turned pale. He finally realized he was caught between two nooses. On one side was the self-slashing knife I offered, and on the other, the guillotine Lucas had already prepared. You too. He turned to look at me, his expression a twisted mix of anger, suspicion, and fear. Zoe, you actually conspired with Lucas? I calmly put down the tablet, a cold smile lingering on my lips. Collusion? No, Mr. Jason, this is called mutual benefit. I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Lucas. I'm just finding a suitable buyer for your soon-to-collapse empire in advance. You, Jason trembled all over. He looked around at the guests and board members who had once flattered and fawned over him, but now not a single person dared to speak up. Everyone could see it, from the moment Lucas stepped through that door, this was no longer a love feud, but a life-and-death capital war. Mr. Jason, I tilted my head, gazing at him calmly, sign it, or not. Tens of thousands of people are waiting in the live stream. Jason's fingers trembled violently above the tablet. Suddenly, he jerked his head up, a flash of madness in his eyes. I won't sign. This is a forgery. All the financial data is made up by you. He shouted at the livestream camera, fellow investors, this woman has gone mad. She fabricated all of this just to get revenge on me. The livestream comments exploded instantly. Murmurs also began to spread among the crowd. Lucas raised an eyebrow slightly, looking at me. I smiled. Mr. Jason, you're saying I fabricated this? I turned the tablet back on and tapped the screen twice. A new window popped up on the big screen, a blockchain hash comparison interface. On the left was the original filing version number of the project codebase at the National Copyright Administration, on the right was the version number of the source code I was now presenting, and in the middle, a striking green annotation, hash values match completely. See clearly? My voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly across the entire hall. You keep saying this is a project developed by the Shin family's technical team, but in the original filing at the National Copyright Administration, the rights holder is listed as the Zhong Group. And that filing was submitted long before today. I paused, enlarging the timestamp in the corner of the screen. 3 years ago, September. That is, before you, Jason, joined the Zhong Group board of directors. Jason froze entirely. The live-streaming comments instantly shifted from skepticism to a torrent of mockery. The murmurs in the crowd swelled into clear, audible discussions. So, Mr. Jason, for the past 3 years, you've been using the Zhong Group's code and passing it off as your own work? No wonder he was so determined to hold on to this project. All the color drained from Jason's face. He opened his mouth, but found no sound coming out. His pride and joy, the technical team he boasted about, the independent research and development he had publicly proclaimed, now lay completely exposed before everyone under the immutable timestamp of the blockchain. He began to back away. Lucas gave a slight nod, his gaze shifting away from Jason and landing on me with a trace of genuine admiration. Miss Zoe, this move of yours is even more masterful than I anticipated. I looked at him and replied softly, likewise. No sooner had the words left my mouth than steady footsteps echoed from the entrance of the banquet hall. 2 financial inspectors in dark uniforms appeared at the door, holding heavy summons in their hands. Mr. Jason, in light of multiple reports received by the Zhong Group regarding your serious violations of regulations, please cooperate with our investigation." The voice was crisp and unyielding. Jason spun around, desperate to escape, but the crowd blocked his path. In his panic, he knocked over the champagne tower the waiter was holding. The sharp clatter of crystal shattering rang out harshly as the wine splashed all over his suit. Yvette let out a scream, cowering in a corner, paralyzed by the sudden turn of events. Her carefully made-up face was now drained of all color, and she curled into a trembling ball. Jason collapsed onto the red carpet. The custom-made suit was soaked through with red wine, making him look as pathetic as a drenched clown. The hall's lights suddenly blazed brighter. The somber string music came to an abrupt halt, replaced by a silence so thick it choked the air. "Mr. Jason, please." Lucas adjusted his cufflinks, his movements distant and aloof. He stepped back half a pace, his gaze falling back on me. "Phase 1 complete, Miss Zoe." He spoke indifferently, the hint of amusement in his eyes growing deeper. "Pleasure doing business." I looked at Jason. He was being escorted out by the staff, his eyes frantically searching through the crowd before finally locking onto me. That gaze was a mix of regret, anger, and disbelief, as if only now did he realize that the woman he had always seen as gentle and submissive had long become the hunter. The cold wind from outside the banquet hall blew in through the doors. Standing amid the wreckage, I felt a calm settle over me, knowing that the one who had been hunted was now the one holding the reins. The second phase begins now. 48 hours after Jason was taken away. I sat in my office, the city awakening in the morning light beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Before me lay the latest internal financial audit report from the Shin Group, each page reading like a death list. "Jason's offshore accounts overseas have been fully frozen," my assistant said in a steady voice. "His gray market channels, mainly operated through Yvette's distant cousin, have all been traced and uncovered. But the Shin Group's situation is worse than we anticipated. He not only embezzled R&D funds but also mortgaged the prime plot of land south of the city." I flipped open the report, my finger pausing at a certain line. The southern city plot, the very asset Lucas had been eyeing. What about Lu Capital? The lawyer's letter for forced liquidation was sent early this morning, demanding the takeover of Shin's assets in the south of the city. I closed the file and lightly tapped the table. Lucas had moved faster than I expected. He was taking advantage of the chaos, but with a precision that was admirable. "And the board of directors?" The assistant hesitated. "Several senior board members have sent a joint letter of protest, stating that your handling of Jason is too aggressive and will affect the group's stability." I picked up the letter of protest, my eyes scanning over the familiar signatures. With a light flick of my fingers, the paper slid into the shredder, the machine's whirring hum crisp and decisive. "Tell them that anyone who's dissatisfied can submit their resignation right now. I'll fill any empty seats with more qualified people within 24 hours." The assistant acknowledged and withdrew. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the door. The hospital VIP ward hallway was long, and the smell of disinfectant was pungent and stinging. As I pushed open the ward door, the silence inside was broken only by the steady, mechanical beeping of the ECG monitor. Yvette was curled up on the hospital bed, her hair disheveled and her complexion sallow. Exquisite skincare products were scattered all over the floor, creating a scene of utter desolation. When she saw me, those dim eyes of hers instantly ignited with a light mixed with jealousy, madness, and fear. "Zoe, did you come to watch me make a fool of myself?" she rasped, trying to sit up, but she pulled at some wound and winced sharply in pain. I walked to the window and pulled open the heavy blackout curtains. Sunlight flooded in instantly, exposing every shadow and sign of disarray in the hospital room under the light of day. "I'm here to give you one last chance." I tossed a document in front of her, the final account confirmation of Jason's embezzlement of $30 million in R&D funds, which included crucial transfer records linked to an account under Yvette's name. "You were a participant in his financial chain. Sign this indictment, accusing him of manipulating you behind the scenes to launder money, and I can guarantee you a peaceful life from now on." Yvette trembled as she picked up the document, her eyes scanning the clauses swiftly. When she caught sight of the word immunity, a flicker of greed actually flashed through her eyes. Even at this point, she still hadn't learned to restrain herself. "I want to see Jason," she said, looking up at me. "As long as you let me see him, I'll sign." I leaned in, gazing closely at her disheveled face, and said softly, "Jason would love nothing more than to grind your bones to dust right now. To him, you are the one and only, damning stain. Do you really think he'd still want to see you?" I pulled out my phone and played an audio clip. It was a recording of Jason's interrogation in the detention center. His voice was calm, even carrying a hint of brutal frankness. "That woman? She and I were just using each other. As for the embezzlement, she forced me into it under the guise of needing treatment for her illness. All the transfer records bear her personal signature, and I have ample evidence to prove I was led astray." Yvette listened, her pupils contracting sharply before she let out a piercing, grating shriek. "He lied to me. He said he would take care of me for the rest of my life. He said he loved me." Love? I turned off my phone and pulled another document from my bag, letting it float lightly onto the table in front of her. It was a photocopy of a blank medical certificate, from a private clinic, with a blurred hospital stamp in the corner of the copy. I pointed at the line of text. "The director of this clinic almost had his license revoked 3 years ago due to a medical malpractice case. Jason helped him cover it up. That pregnancy report of yours was never even registered at this hospital. The director admitted it himself, Jason made him forge it." Yvette was completely frozen. She stared at the copy of the document, her lips trembling violently. "He didn't even bother to spend the money on a proper grade A hospital to fool you." I straightened up, my tone flat. "In his eyes, you were nothing more than the cheapest card from start to finish." Yvette's fingers clenched the paper, leaving deep creases. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking violently, but no longer sobbing. After a long time, she lifted her head, and the last glimmer of light in her eyes had been completely extinguished. "I'll sign." The pen scratched harshly across the paper. I gathered the documents and turned to leave. As I reached the door, I paused for a moment without turning back. "What Jason said in that recording should be enough to wake you up. I'll arrange for proper care at the nursing home. Your remaining years won't be too bad." There was no response from behind. Only the monotonous beeping of the heart monitor. Stepping out of the hospital, the air carried the crisp chill of early autumn. At the end of the corridor, Lucas leaned against the wall, holding 2 cups of hot coffee. He wore a black coat, looking detached yet striking among the crowd. Seeing me come out, he handed one of the cups over. "All settled?" "All settled." I took the coffee, feeling the perfectly pleasant warmth in my palm. He glanced at me. "I heard someone from the board submitted a letter of protest." "Shredded." Lucas let out a low chuckle, the sound deep and carrying a tone that was almost pleasurable. "Zoe, you're even more decisive than I imagined. I've secured Jason's land in the south of the city. The thing you promised, the joint development rights for the new energy project. When do we sign?" "Come to my office tomorrow morning." He nodded, took 2 steps before stopping, and turned his head. "By the way, a few of Jason's loyal board members sold their voting rights to me in a package this afternoon. If you're short-handed, I can lend them to you for now." I took a sip of coffee. "How much did they sell?" "Everything." He curled the corner of his mouth. When faced with the threat of margin calls, they ran faster than anyone else. They even handed over the recordings and documents of Jason's illegal fundraising to buy themselves a way out. I rubbed the warm surface of the cup. "Then Jason has no cards left on the board at all?" "Not a single one." Lucas's figure grew fainter as he walked toward the end of the corridor. I stood there watching his back, the bitterness of the coffee dissolving on my tongue. This round ended sooner than I had expected. The corridor of the detention center was damp and cold, with mottled water stains on the walls resembling clawing ghostly shadows. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room hummed with an electrical buzz, casting cold light onto the floor, illuminating two silhouettes in confrontation. Jason sat across from me. His prison uniform was yellowed, and his hair hung messily over his forehead, with dark stubble sprouting from his once meticulously groomed sideburns. He stared at me, his eyes bloodshot. "Mr. Jason, long time no see." I slid the asset transfer agreement toward him. Shin City Southland, upstream and downstream supply chain contracts, the remaining core patent licenses, all the liquidable high-quality assets were consolidated into these dozen or so pages. As long as he signed, the joint entity of Zhong's Group and Lu Capital could officially take over everything. "Zoe." His voice was hoarse, yet it still carried a faint, unwilling sneer. "You think you've won? The Shin family still has cards to play on the board." I looked at him, my heart utterly unruffled. "The afternoon before last, your few trusted allies already sold their voting rights to Lucas." "Not just the voting rights." I opened my phone, pulled up several recordings, and pressed play. In the recording, Jason's most trusted lieutenant spoke with a trembling, urgent voice. "The 3 sums of money Mr. Jason had me handle privately all came from bridge loans through shell companies. I've kept all the emails and transfer receipts and can submit them at any time." The cold smile froze on Jason's face. "To protect themselves," I said, slipping the phone back into my bag, "they voluntarily handed over all the evidence that could convict you." He slammed his hands onto the table, the handcuffs clattering against the iron surface with a dull, piercing sound. "You. Vicious?" I rose to my feet, looking down at him. "Jason, from the day you stole my code and pushed me into the fire, you should have known this day would come. You weren't playing a game against me, you were playing against the laws of business. And you lost. Completely." I reached the doorway and stopped. "Oh, by the way, Yvette has already signed the indictment. Not only does it testify to your money laundering activities, but it also details how you coerced her into falsifying medical reports. The 2 affidavits together are enough to keep you inside for 15 years. The sound of a chair crashing to the floor came from behind me. I didn't look back. Walking out of the detention center, the sunlight stung my eyes, making me squint slightly. 3 days later, I received word that Jason, on the 3rd day after the preliminary verdict, had suffered a mental breakdown and was sent to the medical isolation unit of the detention center. He kept shouting, "Someone is trying to kill me," and refused to cooperate with any interrogation procedures. The once proud and confident heir of the Shin family, now that his power and freedom had both crumbled, was left with nothing but an empty shell. That same week, the liquidation process for the Shin Group officially began. The South City land parcel was taken over by Lu Capital, while the core technology patents and supply chain contracts were fully integrated by the Zhong Group. 1/3 of the mid-level management from the former Shin Group submitted their resignations, while the remaining employees were rehired after undergoing rigorous background checks. The Zhong Group's territory had nearly doubled in size compared to when Jason was in power. Yvette was placed in a private sanatorium in the south. Her accounts were frozen, and all her social media profiles were deleted, erasing her completely from public view. Occasionally, a nurse would mention that the patient would always sit alone by the window, staring into space, as if waiting for someone, or perhaps wondering where she had gone wrong. I arranged for money to be sent to her on time, neither too much nor too little, just enough to maintain a decent lifestyle. That was the only mercy I could offer, and it was where my kindness ended. At the top of the Zhong Group building, the wind was always colder and sharper than anywhere else. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city bathed in neon lights. The flowing car lights on the streets were like a river of stars, and I stood high above, with nothing but the territories I had personally reclaimed in my line of sight. President Zoe, the final signature. The assistant placed the documents on the table. It was the final cooperation plan between Zhong Group and Lu Capital regarding the closed loop of the entire industrial chain. After signing it, Zhong Group would completely swallow up the remaining territory of the Shin family. I picked up the pen, its tip making crisp strokes across the paper. The office door swung open without a knock. Lucas walked in against the light. Still dressed in his dark suit, he exuded the cold, commanding aura of someone in complete control. He tossed the final bid results for the South City plot onto the desk. I got what you asked for. He leaned against the edge of the desk, his gaze fixed on me, not with the smugness of a victor, but with a scrutinizing, profound intent. I've seen the final data on the new energy project. You're bolder than Jason, and more precise and ruthless. In this industry, you're even more suited to be my adversary, or perhaps my ally, than I expected. I looked up at him. Between us stood a desk worth hundreds of millions, yet our gazes collided midair, straight and unwavering. President Lucas, in business, there are no eternal allies, only eternal interests. My slender fingers gently brushed over the authorization document. You helped me eliminate a major threat, and I gave you the assets you wanted. In this transaction, we owe each other nothing. Lucas let out a soft chuckle. He walked around the long table, leaned over slightly, placed both hands on the surface, and half enclosed me within his shadow. The ambiguous distance made the air thick and heavy, those unfathomably deep eyes seemingly able to suck my very soul in. What if I don't want to be just an ally? His voice was low, carrying a heart-stirring magnetism. Zoe, you don't need redemption. You just need someone who can stand as your equal. That spot has always been vacant. I didn't look away. I met his gaze, a slight curve forming at the corner of my lips. President Lucas might have the wrong person. I've just broken free from a cage of marriage. When it comes to so-called feelings, all that's left for me is a sharp eye for numbers. My mind is full of these data curves, no room for anything else. He looked at me for a long moment, then suddenly straightened up and laughed out loud. It was a real laugh, not the perfunctory, fake one used in business. Very well. He stood up straight, adjusted his cuffs, and the amusement in his eyes grew even thicker. I like your kind of soul, sober to the point of being cold. As for the new energy project, I'll have my team liaise directly with yours. As for our relationship. He stopped at the door, turned his head slightly, and said in a measured tone, I look forward to the next time we cross paths, in the business arena, or elsewhere. The door clicked softly shut. The office fell silent once more. I turned around to face the sprawling cityscape outside the window. I once believed love was salvation, so I humbly gave everything, only to be killed by betrayal. Only now do I understand that true freedom is found when you stand atop this solitary peak, looking down upon the masses. The phone on the desk vibrated. A push notification appeared on the screen, the final confirmation from the Securities Regulatory Commission regarding the complete liquidation of the Shin Group. I stared at the news, my fingertip gently gliding across the screen. Within this vast empire, I have finally become the sole helmsman. I need no one's promises, nor anyone's protection. Clarity and strength are my throne. I stood up, smoothed my clothes, and pushed open the door to the office. Outside were thousands of employees awaiting decisions, countless stock price curves poised to open, and a future that truly belonged to me. The sunlight fell on my face, warm but not scorching. I did not look back. In this life, I have not fallen into anyone's trap. Long ago, I became the one who moves the pieces on this entire board. Ahead lies only a grander arena of play, and I walk forward with an unhurried step,